We're now going to take a look at distributing materials by using a function graph from the altitude of a procedural terrain. This will also work for height field terrains, since it also has the same sort of altitude production. So I'm just going to add in a procedural terrain. Let's go ahead and open up the editor. And it went ahead and added a material layer to that. I'm going to go ahead and delete that because I don't want that in there right now. I just want the default for the moment, and we're going to change it in a little bit. But what I want to do is turn off the zero edges, and I'm going to go into the function. And I am going to switch this over to the terrain fractal version 2. And then I'm going to go over to the multiply setting and just bring that down to 32. Here we can see the terrain. And we could randomize it a few times if we wanted to. Let's see what comes up. And that should be good right there. And I'm going to go ahead and hit OK, and then I'm going to move over into the front view and just bring it down just a little in the height using the bounding box, or you could use the scaling gizmo to bring it down. So right now we're looking primarily at procedural distribution and not looking at the painted layers, which we can actually use them hand in hand. We could have the procedural distribution and then painting on top of it. But right now I just want to show you how we can just use the graph itself to define material presence. So first thing I'm going to do is replace the default material with one of my rock materials. And I'm also going to go ahead at this point and save the scene so you can load in the terrain at this point if you'd like to follow along. So you can load in material distribution functions, and this is the scene that's available. I'm going to go ahead and just bring down the specular amount, the highlight intensity. A lot of these materials were generated and created in versions of Vue before photometric lighting, and it can peak too much on the specular level. And rather than creating a separate sunlight with different specular value, just reducing the highlight in the material. So we can either define this manually, the distribution, or we can have Vue set it up for us, which is new to version 2016. So let's go ahead and take a look at how to have Vue basically set this up for us. It's actually pretty easy to do by itself. I'll show you the manual way, which is if we take a look at the terrain fractal, we have a couple of different outputs. We have rough areas and then very rough areas, which is just a higher contrast version of the rough areas. That can also be defined by using the reference feature size. This is grayed out right now because nothing is connected to the rough area output. If we right-click, go to Output, we can select a custom dependency and then connect that to the rough areas. And then you can add an input custom dependency in the material to connect it. And we'll see that in a moment. First, let's take a look at just having Vue do it. Click OK. So we're going to go to the Paint tab, and now we're going to load in a new material. And I'm going to select to use the graph to drive the presence. So we're not going to use a painted layer. We're just going to use the functions. So I'm going to select the grass, and now it's going to open up this pop-up where we can select the terrain fractal. And I'm going to select rough areas. Now, if you click off of this, it will not assign it properly. So make sure that you do select it right away, because sometimes it just doesn't show up. And it looks like it actually just removed my layer. So I might have clicked off. We'll try that again. Rough areas. There we go. So now when we go into the material, and we take a look, and first I'll go ahead and highlight, and we don't want the grass super shiny. I'll change it out to 0.1. And we're going to go to the alpha production, and we take a look, we can see that the alpha right here is connected to an external dependency where it says procedural terrain custom. Now this is what we just selected for the rough areas. And if we open up the terrain, we should see a custom dependency. So it's actually created custom dependencies, 2 of them. One from that failed attempt, it looks like. Both connected to the rough areas. So I'm going to rename one of these to rough, and then delete the other one. I'm not sure which one it's using, so I'm going to go in and if I have to reselect, and it looks like I deleted the one that was in use. So I'll just change that over and we'll get back to where we were before. So right now it's just using the regular rough areas and not the high contrast. We can adjust the filter for it. But first, let's just go ahead and take a look at a render of this. I am going to make a few changes in the atmosphere editor. Just hit F4 to open it. Go to Light, Global Ambience, and then I'm going to select the sun, turn off the sun softness, and this will just allow us to render a little quicker. Set that to final, and we'll just take a look at it as it is. So this is with just those rough areas, no customization to filtering or anything like that. And we can see that the grass is showing up on the smoother areas and is being excluded on the rockier parts of the terrain. And one thing I want to note is that the alpha distribution and alpha productions for the material layers are reversed from pretty much every single other software program I've ever used, meaning that black is what shows through rather than white. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're layering. Now, one thing we could do if we wanted something a little higher contrast without changing the input is we can edit the filter. And I'm going to go ahead and just increase it right there, setting the 0 almost to 1. And now we can see a lot higher of a contrast. Go ahead and render that and take a look. And now we have a more prominent material layer showing up, where we don't have such a fade in between. So we could keep editing that filter that way, or we could select a different input. Keep in mind too, we can still go through and manually set this up. We don't have to use the terrain editor auto setup as we did before. So let's say we want to change this over to very rough areas. We could select that instead, and then if I want, I can go ahead and just reset that filter, and we can see how that looks. Get a quick preview. Showing up. And that looks like there's still a little bit too much coverage, so I can go back and edit that one as well. And the output range might be a little different. So one thing you can always do is if you go into the function, we can take a look at the node preview and see exactly where our output is. So we can see right here the high points and the low points. Also, if I was to connect to the rough areas, we can see that it has a different output range. So the very rough areas are going to be the small rocks, basically, that are showing up in here. And this is still the previous render from before with the rough area selected. So that's going to give us all those little fine rocks. So we could even have a different material setup for that if we wanted to. Auto mapping is a new node that's added in Vue 2016, which will give us a better output and should give us something around -1 to 1. Typically it's used more for height field terrains, and right now it doesn't actually look like it's giving much of a change to this input at all. If we want to preview what it's going to look like, we could just take the altitude and take a look, and there's our rough areas, and then our very rough areas, so we can see the smaller rocks. Go back to rough areas, and we can select the terrain fractal, and now if we adjust the feature size, we have more control over the larger sections and what's going to be covered here. And you will eventually reach a point where there are no changes to the feature size. That actually looks kind of cool, and you could even use that as part of a terrain mixing with something else. Go ahead and scale that down. And then once again, keep in mind that black is going to be what shows through rather than the white. So we can adjust that, and then when we find something we like, we can bring it back to the altitude where it was before, and then take a look at the material distribution. So if we want to move a little further beyond this, I want to mix. Let's make some cracks to add in. Let's do a noise, and we will do line patterns and sparse cracks. Increase the crack width. And let's just go ahead and take a look at it on its own. A little large there. And I'm actually going to go ahead and cut out the top portion, because we have that really sharp cutoff, and that's one thing that happens with sparse cracks. So if we take a look at the output, we can see that those basically start at 0. So one thing we can do is go to Filter, and I'm going to use, instead of using the map, I'm going to use the smooth map, which will cut off certain areas. Go ahead and connect that to the output. And then I could set the upper value to 0, and we can see it start to smooth that out on the top. And if we need to, we can go down just a little further, and we could do -0.1, and maybe cut it down a little sooner. Okay, so now I'm going to take this, let's go ahead and adjust the scale. And then I'm going to mix this together with the altitude output. So we're going to add in a combiner. Let's use a combiner node. Add in the altitude of the terrain fractal, and then I'm going to go ahead and add in from the smooth map into input 2, altitude into the output of that. And now it's just mixing them straight right now, straight together. I'm going to set it to max, and then take input 2 and reduce it. Or actually, we can go ahead and offset it, which might be easier. And then I'm going to go ahead and create another combiner. Let's just do a blender this time, see if that works out. And what I want is the difference, because I do want to be able to define these new areas with their own material distribution, but what's going to happen is if I do it right now from the current noise right here, it's going to cover up everything, and it's not going to give us this mix. So I'm going to create kind of a subtractive value, sort of a difference, and then use that. So I'm going to use the output from the combiner, and then the altitude from the terrain fractal. Connect that to here just to take a look at it. Set it to subtract. And now we have that difference. So that is going to be our material control. Let's just make sure that's going to give us a good range. I'm going to need to adjust the output of that. Let's go ahead and use the map. Connect that to there. And paying attention to our output, change our scale. And let's see, We want our value -1 to 1 on the output. And let's take a look and try to get that lower value. And I'm also going to clip the upper value a bit. Actually, let's go ahead and change this to a smooth map. Lower value 0, 0.5, and 0.3. And now remember, black is what's going to show through. So let's do output range 1 to -1. Let's see how that looks. And that should be okay. So that should give us a good distribution. So I'm going to add an output node, and let's just call it cracks. So that's our distribution for the new setup here. And then we'll go to our combiner and connect our altitude to that. So there we go. Now this isn't very interesting. Obviously, the cracks, they're very smooth, but I just wanted to show you how you can mix the distributions. So let's go ahead and click OK. And edit the material, and we're going to set this up manually this time. So we're going to load in a layer, and let's do something like that brown strata, something that's going to show differently. I'm going to change the alpha boost to 0, because otherwise it's just going to be fading in. So now we can see that showing up, and let's change the alpha production. So our alpha here, and then I'm going to add in input node, external dependency, and we can choose from that terrain the cracks we just created. Connect our alpha to the cracks, and we should see that showing up just on those areas. And then we can go back and adjust if we need to clip it more or cut it off more. So it's not a perfect match. There's a little bit of a gap there. But for the most part, it's overall matched up. So you can go in and refine it if you need to, but I just wanted to show you a way we could kind of mix things together and still pull out specific sections. Because otherwise, if we don't have that subtractive amount, then it's just going to show that crack pattern all over, even though we only have it mixed slightly. And here's the terrain from just a little bit farther away. You can see more of those sections that are blended in. Now, these alphas are not limited to materials. You can also use them to control ecosystem layers, which are technically material layers, I guess. But either way, we don't have to use just a material. So let's go ahead and add in an ecosystem. Add an ecosystem layer, and it just replaced my brown strata. And I'm going to load in just some simple fast rendering trees. We'll go over to trees and select the first ones are going to be the fastest rendering ones. They are the oldest trees there are and have probably the lowest polygon amounts. We can select the maple. And let's do the plum, which is going to be a small tree. And then I'm going to just throw in the cherry tree as well afterwards. Another thing you could do is actually just keep this open and just drag the trees into the population. And that way you could just keep this window open and keep dragging in the trees you want. And then once you're done, you could just close it. So I'm going to increase the scale of the plum tree to 1.6, just so it's a little bit larger. And then I'm going to actually go over to the color, set a variable color, reset it, and let's give something dark and higher saturation. And then I'm going to go ahead and populate, and now it's going to cover everything up. And I'm going to change my global preview display to just the flat billboard and not the shaded billboard. So now what we have is the ability to edit the alpha of this. And what we can do is what we did before, adding in input, external dependency, and choosing the cracks again, setting our alpha on that, populate, and now it's just showing up where the material was showing earlier. So just on those specific features. And you could also control the density with that external dependency rather than using the alpha, but the alpha I think is a lot easier because then you can adjust the density. If you want to make it a lot higher, it's a lot easier to control it that way when you have it with an alpha cutting off the rest of it. And now we have a densely packed ecosystem on just where those areas of the crack noise are showing through the terrain. And we'll be taking a much closer look at distributions once we start looking at the height field terrains and taking a look at the erosion nodes, because there's a lot of cool stuff we can do with that, along with mixing the paintings along with it too. So painting on the layers and mixing that with fractals, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do.